Hello, my name is Jeff Kindhart, and this is Take 3 for post-harvest handling and transportation methods that allow small-scale growers to deliver top-quality produce. Just as a fun fact, I recorded this once and it was so quiet no one could hear it. I recorded it a second time, but I hit the space button too quickly and it cut off the last word and the first word of every one of my slides. So hopefully third time will in fact be the charm as we go together to explore post-harvest handling. Why are good post-harvest practices important? High-quality, disease-free produce with a good shelf life is a result of good production practices, proper handling during harvest, and appropriate post-harvest handling and storage. This is a diagram that shows what would have been the typical distribution pattern or chain of events that occurred 20 years ago. Items would have been harvested from a farm, packed either at the farm or at a remote packing shed facility. They would then remain in cold storage, typically at the packing house, until that evening, at which point they were loaded onto a truck and would arrive at the wholesaler on the second day. People would come through the wholesaler and determine what it was that they wished to have delivered to their retail operation. The items would be loaded the second night from the wholesaler and travel to the retailer. The retailer would then receive items on the third morning. Typically they would be stored for, in many cases, another day, so that we had a one-day buffer in the commodity that we had for retail sales. And then they would be put out on the shelf on the fourth day, although in some cases it may have been the third day before the consumer received the items. In this longer chain of events, there was even more time for things to go bad with post-harvest handling. In the local food movement and with small farms, most commonly we are going directly to either a restaurant or a consumer, perhaps an institution, but we are skipping some of the steps in this chain, and principally we're skipping the wholesaler almost always, and so we're cutting at least one day out of the distribution time, allowing us to deliver fresher commodity. In some cases, we may be cutting many steps out. We may be harvesting peaches tonight, putting them into a cooler, and selling them the following morning at a farmer's market, for example. And we skip lots of steps in this chain of events. But regardless, there is going to be some period, no matter how close we are to delivering the stuff straight to the consumer, there's going to be some period of post-harvest handling that will be involved in our venture as a small-scale fruit or vegetable producer. And it is important that we utilize good post-harvest practices to maintain the quality of the produce that we are raising. And by quality, post-harvest handling can affect things such as appearance, texture, flavor, and even the nutritive value of the commodity that we are selling. There are a number of sources of information for good post-harvest handling practices. This happens to be one that I like, and we're going to look at several charts that come from this publication from University of California at Davis called Small Scale Post-Harvest Handling Practices, a Manual for Horticultural Crops. I think it is a particularly germane publication because it focuses on many of the tools, technologies, and methods that would be used by smaller scale producers, which in many cases are actually significantly different than what might be done for a large wholesale producing operation. By the way, this document is downloadable as a PDF from the internet, so no worries about copying down the information. Simply download the document and browse it. In the manual, it starts to break things down into different groups and classes. If we're going to discuss anything, we wind up needing to categorize it for purposes of discussion. And one of the first ways that we need to categorize fruits and vegetables is looking at, is it something that is picked and sold as an immature fruit or vegetable, or something that is a mature fruit or vegetable? And let's talk about what the difference between those two things are. In the world of harvesting and post-harvesting, there are two discrete concepts. One is whether or not the fruit or vegetable is mature. And what that means simply is this. If it's mature, I can remove the seeds from the fruit or vegetable that I just picked, give those seeds the proper after ripening period or whatever seed treatment they need to make them capable of germination, and they are mature enough that the seed is viable and capable of producing a new individual. Immature plants, if I take the seed out, it is not developed far enough along that that seed is going to be viable. There is a second thing that we should talk about while we're at this juncture, and that is ripe. Produce, in most cases, first goes through maturity, and then from maturity it goes on to ripen. Ripening is associated typically with a change in color of the commodity, an increase in the sugar content, and a softening of the cell walls, and a softening of the entire fruit or vegetable itself. And so we've got maturity and ripeness. And at this chart, we're looking at what vegetables do we pick at an immature stage versus those harvested at a mature stage. Immature harvested vegetables would include things like cucumbers and squash, hopefully. Now, all of us know that sometimes we're late getting to the squash, and it's probably mature. When it gets to be the size of a club, it's about mature at that point. Not really very good for eating, so we would like to harvest it when it was immature. Okra is also picked immature. This particular chart shows peppers listed as in the immature category. Very honestly, many growers will wait until the pepper is mature because that results in an increase in yield on a per acre or per foot of row basis. And so I kind of question whether or not pepper shouldn't be down in the bottom group rather than the top group. Those things that are picked as mature, the bottom of this chart would include things like perhaps peppers, as well as tomatoes, melons, apples, and stone fruit, cherries, peaches, those kinds of things. With immature harvested vegetables, we're going to worry about the following. Over maturity at harvest. Did we already mess up before we ever picked them? Were they poor quality to begin with? We also worry about water loss. We worry about, because they're immature, they tend to be pretty soft-skinned, and so we worry a lot about bruising and other mechanical injuries. For example, a lot of times when we have a crew that is out harvesting squash, we will make them wear rubber gloves so that their fingernails don't result in nail marks or cut marks that occur on the skin of the fruit itself. Immature produce, we also worry about chilling injury, and as with all produce, we worry about decay. For those things that are picked as mature, or perhaps even ripe, we worry about bruising, we worry about over-ripening or excessive softness at harvest. One of the problems with picking tomatoes that are dead red ripe, they are so soft that if you stack 4 or 5 of them in a box together, one of them winds up compression bruising his neighbor. And so we can't really pick things that are overripe and expect we're going to have good results if we're going to have to transport this commodity, even if it's just 15 miles to go to town. We're going to have difficulty. We've got to harvest at the correct stage of ripeness to allow for handling and transportation to occur. On mature fruits and vegetables, we also worry about water loss and chilling injury. And I should point out, chilling injury, it refers to this. Many of the commodities that we're going to be dealing with, they don't have to freeze to be injured, almost all of them will be injured if they get to below 32 degrees storage temperature. But there are many commodities that, for example, if we get sweet potatoes below 55 degrees, then we wind up having problems with the quality, and that is referred to as chilling injury. In addition to chilling injury with mature fruits and vegetables, we also worry about compositional changes, as well as is the case I said earlier with all produce, you're trying to minimize or eliminate any decay that might be occurring. And in the UC Davis manual, they go through and list commodities based on their degree of perishability and subsequent relative storage life. Some commodities are very perishable and they have a very short storage life. Even if we do everything right, they're not going to store very long. The book listed as being less than 2 weeks. I think for many of these commodities, I would view them as less than 2 or 3 days rather than 2 weeks. But commodities that have a really short storage life would include things like raspberries and strawberries. Slightly longer, but still very perishable, would be blackberries, asparagus, broccoli, leaf lettuce, mushrooms, muskmelon, and tomatoes that were picked at the pink or riper stage. Sweet corn can have a very short shelf life, or it may have a moderate shelf life. Part of that is going to depend on two things. One, if we have really good post-harvest handling practices, that will extend the length of period of time we can effectively store sweet corn and still have good quality product. The other thing will vary depending on what type of sweet corn it is that we are raising. If we look at modern types of sweet corn, they have so much more sugar in them than the old original SU standard types of sweet corn that we actually can store them for a relatively long period of time. Although, again, I think probably 2 weeks is in fact realistically the limit of what we could expect to store them and still have reasonable commodity for sale. So that was a list of things that were very high in relative perishability. Going down the list, we're moving on to things that are just high in perishability. They're not as much of a prima donna as the previous items discussed, but they are still pretty short-lived in storage. They're listing it as 2 to 4 weeks. Again, I think all of those numbers are very optimistic. I would think this is a group of items that we could expect to hold reasonably well on the farm for maybe a week to 10 days. And they would include things like honeydew or Crenshaw melons, nectarines, peaches. And on the peach and nectarine thing, let's back up. That's going to vary with what the degree of ripeness was when we harvested the commodity. For large commercial orchards where they pick at the correct background color is what it's referred to, they can probably hold peaches for several weeks. For many small-scale growers, they will not begin to harvest until the fruit is really quite ripe and has started to soften just slightly. And in those cases, probably 5 days is the maximum storage life. So peaches and nectarines, it's going to vary how long we can store them effectively based on the stage of ripeness at harvest time. Other items that we could expect to store for 7 to 14 days, maybe even longer. Cabbage can be stored for a very long time. Eggplants and okra, as well as summer squash, can be stored for quite a while. Partially ripe tomatoes, in other words, tomatoes that were picked at perhaps the breaker stage, can be held for 10 days or so, as well as bell peppers, if they're given a good storage environment. Going down the list to items that are moderate in their perishability, in other words, things that are able to be stored quite quite reasonably well, and things that are low in perishability. Some apple varieties are moderate in their perishability, and other items would include table beets, carrots, radishes, and B grade or smaller, immature, or new, sometimes referred to as new, potatoes. Those can probably be stored for 3 or 4 weeks effectively. Things that can undergo long-term storage, and they're looking at 8 to 16 weeks. And in the case of some cultivars of apples, if given a controlled atmosphere storage, they can actually be held much longer than the time frames that we're talking about here. But things that we could expect to hold for several months would include some varieties of apple, mature potatoes. If you're going to try to store potatoes, you might want to consider treating them with a sprout inhibitor. Dried onions, and these are not going to be the Vidalia or Granix types onions, but dried onions. Garlic, pumpkin, winter squash, and sweet potatoes are all examples of other things that can be held for quite a period of time if we're providing them with the proper storage conditions, and still be very good commodity to deliver to our consumers. We've already had talks about good agricultural practices or GAP practices, and that all ties directly in with post-harvest handling. We have got to protect food safety at every opportunity during our post-harvest handling. Maintain good sanitation. Wash your picking buckets out. Make sure everybody's washing their hands after they use the restroom facility. If we've got composting horse manure on the farm for our mushroom operation, that needs to be located a great distance from our packing shed, and the tools and the people that work there probably don't need to come to the packing shed where we're packing fresh produce on days when they're working with the manure. Avoid introduction of pathogens. Don't have buckets that we just use to tote manure and then turn around and take it out to the tomato patch and go harvest tomatoes. I understand, as ludicrous as that may sound, it does happen on occasion, and usually with a very dissatisfactory result. And as always, keep food from spoiling. I mean, nobody wants to buy rotten produce, and once we start getting spoilage occurring in our area where we're storing commodity, that stuff can snowball. The whole story of one bad apple can ruin the bunch. There is some degree of accuracy to that statement. We want to do everything we can to reduce losses between harvest and consumption. Simply put, it improves efficiency and it improves profitability. And this is not all related to post-harvest handling. A big chunk of it is related to consumer behaviors, but sometime if you like to cringe, look up what percent of food is wasted in the United States of America. It's really quite a disheartening figure should you go and examine such a thing. We want to reduce losses between harvest and consumption so we maximize efficiency of our system and profitability return back to the grower. The processes associated with post-harvest handling begin by definition the moment the produce is harvested. Everything from that point on is obviously post-harvest handling. Avoid rough handling. You've got to train your workers, and I will be honest with you, training workers, quite frankly, is nowhere near enough. You also have to have someone out there monitoring workers. If you have people picking strawberries, for example, into gallon buckets, if you can hear those strawberries thumping on the bottom of the bucket as they begin harvesting into a new bucket, that means they're dropping them 8 or 10 inches. Every one of those strawberries is probably going to be bruised, and it's going to be very poor quality, much quicker to decay, and not very satisfactory from the consumer point of view. So train your workers to handle the produce in an appropriate fashion, and then monitor them to make sure that they actually are. Use appropriate harvesting containers. We're going to look in a little bit at an example where they're harvesting tomatoes that are at the breaker stage, which are still very firm. We can use a tall container when we're doing that. If we're picking tomatoes that are at the pink stage, we have to use a very shallow container, because if we don't, the commodity at the bottom of the picking container will all suffer compression bruising from the weight of the tomatoes that are stacked on top of it. And probably most importantly, keep the product as cool as possible all the time, and that begins the second that we harvest it. You know, once we have it harvested and we get it to typically a pickup truck bed, a trailer, a wagon, awaiting transport to the packing shed, if we can, let's try to get that in the shade or put shade cloth over the top of it so that the harvested commodity is not sitting in some kind of container, pail, or bucket exposed to the sunshine. Once we've trained our help, we've got our stuff picked into appropriate containers, we kept it in the shade until it was time to bring it into the shed. Anyway, now we need to spend just a second talking about packing methods. And packing methods vary widely throughout the state from grower to grower, and they can include anything from, basically no packing method to field packing to a full bore packing shed with a packing line, to retail in, or peaches where we're going to pick them directly into the pack or half pack cardboard box that ultimately we're going to sell the commodity in. There are a few growers who have a different kind of field packing, and that is a self-propelled field packing system. They can be used for sweet corn, peppers, snap beans. Not very commonplace in Illinois, but there are a few operations that do have. Here's two examples of field packing. Strawberries being picked into clamshells. The clamshells are sealed. They go into a flat, and the entire flat is what's going to be sold. Or in the bottom right, you see an individual that's out harvesting peaches, placing the peaches as he picks them directly into the cardboard pack box that they're going to be sold out. One thing that I would like to see, and I talked about this earlier, it would be really awesome if he had some kind of canopy over the top of this so that those peaches were not laying out in the sun until he got the entire wagon full and got it drug up to the building. Here's some examples of field packing for bell peppers in the upper left and for squash in the bottom right. I told you earlier, picking containers is a big deal. Here's some individuals that are harvesting tomatoes at the breaker stage, and you can look, they've got a very tall picking hamper, but because the tomatoes are being picked at a stage where they've begun the ripening process, but they're not very ripe, they are still very firm, and they can withstand being stacked as high as you see them being stacked in this picking hamper without suffering any damage. If we were going to pick pinks or red ripes with the same container, the bottom 20 tomatoes would be bruised and damaged and unmarketable. So the picking container needs to be appropriate to the commodity that we're harvesting, as well as the stage of ripeness for what it is that we're picking. One of my pet peeves, we can have a lot of damage on the trip from the field to the packing shed. We used the right container, we harvested at the right time, we kept our wagon in the shade, everything's good. Now we decide it's time to do our NASCAR trip from the field up to the packing shed. We drive across ruts and rough spots in the road, and we don't bounce just one or two peaches, but we bounce the entire trailer full of them, resulting in almost uniform bruising across all of them. So slow down. Buy yourself a box blade. The road that goes out to the packing shed, let's keep it graded and smooth, and let's make sure that we're not playing NASCAR on the trip in with the produce. And also the trip from the field to the packing shed, keep everything shaded as long as possible. As soon as we get to the packing shed, either have an area where we've got a roof we can back wagons or trailers underneath of, or some shade cloth put up, something so that the commodity doesn't sit there at the packing shed, again out in full sun, awaiting its turn to go across the packing line. When we talk about a packing shed, what does that consist of? Again, if there's 14,000 growers in Illinois, there would be 14,000 different kinds of packing sheds in Illinois. I mean, they just vary. They can be as simple as nothing more than a roof. They can have sides on them and be basically a building. And in some cases, they may even be a very substantial building that has got a controlled atmosphere or controlled environment within the building, heating and air conditioning and the whole 9 yards. So it can vary from nothing more than a roof to an entire enclosed structure with heating and air conditioning. Packing sheds may have a packing line. For small growers, that may consist of 2 laundry folding tables. It might be pretty simplistic. And as we get larger in size and handle greater volume, the packing lines become increasingly more complex. The packing shed should have an area where we have access to cold storage. And if we are going to wind up loading large trucks, we should have a loading dock. By having a loading dock, it allows us to just have a pallet jack, and we're able to take the pallet jack from our packing shed straight into the back of the tractor trailer, dump the pallet off, and return the pallet jack back to our packing shed. If we don't have a loading dock, then you look at having to have a forklift and the associated expenses with maintaining that forklift. So a loading dock's nice as you get larger in size and start loading trucks. For smaller growers, there's probably really no need for a loading dock even. The packing line, it needs to be appropriate in size and complexity for the size of your operation, and it needs to be designed to work with the commodity you grow. What do we mean by that? Well, if you went to the right place in the world, you might be able to find growers that were using an apple packing line to pack tomatoes. The problem is this: apples are capable of taking a much longer drop without bruising than what tomatoes are. So I can take this same line and effectively use it to size tomatoes, get them washed and all that good stuff, but I wind up with a high percent of damage because the system was designed to have drops that were acceptable for apples but are not acceptable for tomatoes. So make sure you're buying something designed to work with what it is that you're actually going to grow and run across the packing line. And again, packing lines vary widely by. They can have some or all of these components, and components could include things like a dump, a receiving line, a washer or washer and waxer, inspection tables, sizers, and label applicators. As you increase in size and decide you want to start going into grocery stores, most grocery stores now, every tomato, every pepper has got to have its own individual sticker on it so that they can be checked out without having to look them up in the book by the individuals that are running the checkout lanes. In addition to a sizer and label applicator, sorting tables, boxing equipment of some kind, and almost always some mechanism of conveyors. That conveyance mechanism may be nothing but rollers so that the boxes are easily pushed, or it can be actual mechanical conveyor belts. Or in a lot of cases, we have some of both on the packing line. Some of the belts are mechanical belts, and some of them are belts with just rollers that you have to push. And here's an example of a diagram of a complex packing line. Probably not something that would be used by a beginning farmer, but it gives you an idea of how complicated these can be. They're going to come into a water dump in many cases, get picked up out of the water dump by a conveyor, dumped into a separate washing tank. And that washing tank, going back to our GAP stuff, we're going to maintain the proper chlorine levels inside that washing tank and make sure that we're not going to cross-contaminate all of our entire load through the washing facility. From the washer, they're going to get picked up and go out to a drying brushing system. If appropriate, they may have wax applicator behind that. And wax is simply food-grade vegetable wax, and it's used for things like cucumbers, sometimes peppers, and that thin layer of wax that we apply does two things. One, it makes the commodity shiny and pretty, and secondly, that thin layer of wax slows down the rate at which the produce wants to dry out, desiccate, and shrivel. And so waxing does occur depending on what the commodity is. We're then going to come out of the drying and wax applicator and go to some sort of a grading facility. Typically these are going to have rollers on it, and the commodity is going to be rolling around and around so that you can stand at the edge of the table and visually inspect and see all sides of the produce as it rolls by you. And if you see any blemishes, problems, defects, it's going to come off and go out to the cull line at the grader. From the grader it goes into the sizer, and from the sizer different drops are going to occur with the sizer, so that we drop all of the small tomatoes or apples out at one table, larger apples a little bit further down, and the really big apples all the way at the end. In other cases it may be actually the reverse of this process. It depends on how the packing line is set up. But we then, at this boxing table, it's sort of our final inspection point, and some produce still gets pulled out here and goes off to the cull belt line, but for the most part we've got good commodity. Once it reaches the boxing table, the things are boxed up and then get put onto pallets, go to the cold storage facility at the packing shed, loaded onto the truck once we get pallets accumulated, and they're off to the market. We should talk about, at this boxing station, for example, if we're talking about tomatoes, you may have 3 different boxes sitting in front of you, and although we've got just one size of tomato at our particular station, we're going to put all of those tomatoes that are just at the breaker stage in one box so that the pack is uniform. We're going to put tomatoes that are almost to the pink stage, they're beyond breaker, in a second box, and we're going to put tomatoes that are pink or beyond into a third box. People need to have uniformity in the pack that you are delivering them. You don't want to have red ripe tomatoes in the exact same box at which we have breaker tomatoes, because what's going to happen, somebody opens the box, they look, and there's breakers on top. They're going, well, this box isn't really ready to use yet. We're going to leave it in the cooler for another 2 days. When they finally pull it out, the top has developed pink color. It's good. It's ready to use. Now the bottom of the box, where there were some red ripes, are now turned to ketchup or tomato juice or something even more foul than that, and they're not going to buy from you again. So when we go to box, we want to have uniformity of size and uniformity of maturity and ripeness. The first diagram was pretty complex that we looked at. This is probably where your 3rd and 4th year beginning farmer is going to get to. On the first year, you're going to start out with a couple of laundry folding tables, I expect, and as you get more complex, you're going to buy a smaller packing line like you see here, where we've got a little receiving belt where we dump the buckets. There's a conveyor on it. It carries things into the washer, and in this case, you're not going to have the capacity to monitor chlorine levels or the time to do that, so you just use fresh potable water all the time. You don't recycle any of the water in this particular system. We use fresh potable water for washing the produce. That potable water then gets run out to waste or run to a storage tank, and later we may pick it up and use it for irrigation, but we don't recycle it and use it to wash produce a second time. Once the produce comes out the back of the washer, in some cases we're going to have a piece of burlap hanging at the back side of that that's got food grade wax. We've talked about waxing, and as it comes out the washer, it gets a little bit of wax put on it. It then is going to go across some sponge donuts, for lack of a better word, that are going to absorb the water and dry the produce down. It then dumps out onto a rotary sorting table, and in these simple lines there is no sizing. So again, we said earlier that we want to have uniformity in our box and our pack in terms of size, uniformity in terms of maturity and ripeness. So you're going to have a couple of people standing around this rotary sorting table. If it were tomatoes, for example, one person is going to be picking out the really large and medium and small red ripes, and further around on the table, somebody's going to be picking out the really large, the medium size, and the really small breakers. And so these still work even though they don't have a mechanical sizer. As an operations grow in size, then it becomes actually more efficient to have packing lines that have sizers on them. But for small growers, quite honestly, there's no way you could ever justify the expense of buying a packing line or buying the building to hold the packing line that would be required for having a sizer associated. After we get done packing the produce, we want to get it put into cold storage. Cold storage is the most important factor for maintaining quality. If we've done everything right through the growing process, for us to maintain the quality that we've achieved by our good growing practices, we have to have access to cold storage. Cold storage removes field heat. It lowers the respiration. Remember, produce is still undergoing cellular respiration. It's still taking in oxygen and evolving carbon dioxide and generating heat. By cooling the produce, putting it in cold storage, we lower that rate of respiration. Cold storage also results in the reduction of water loss, and it decreases sensitivity to ethylene for those crops that are ethylene sensitive. Here's an example. Even after harvest, strawberries remain alive and produce heat as a natural consequence of their cellular respiration. If we were to store strawberries at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, a ton of them produce about 3,300 BTUs per day. Whereas if we just leave them out on the bench in our packing shed at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, that same ton of strawberries produces over 10 times the amount of heat, 41,800 BTUs. So it's very important that we get commodity cooled. If we don't get it cooled, what happens is as we're generating all these BTUs of heat, it makes it warmer and makes the strawberries undergo respiration faster, which makes them generate more heat, and it becomes this loop which results in very rapid losses due to decay and loss. Here is sort of a sum totality of what could be involved in maintaining the chains of coldness all the way from harvesting to ultimately being picked up by the end consumer. And again, many in the local food arena may not have all of these steps in the middle, but this is a entire circumstance of events that would occur from beginning to end for maintaining good cold storage. Why is this cold storage so important? Again, we said earlier, it suppresses respiratory activity, and it also decreases enzymatic degradation. So the stuff is going to soften at a slower rate. We're going to have less water loss. We are going to inhibit most, not all, but most organisms associated with decay. Most of the molds, the fungal organisms and bacteria are going to be suppressed at cooler temperatures, not eliminated, but suppressed. And we're going to reduce the production of ethylene in those commodities that are ethylene producers, and we are going to minimize the reaction to ethylene in those products that are ethylene sensitive. Ethylene is a plant hormone, oftentimes referred to as the ripening hormone, and ethylene is kind of why the expression of one bad apple ruins the bunch. The one bad apple evolves lots of ethylene. That ethylene makes the other apples around it start to mature and senesce, go through the dying process more rapidly, and so the one bad apple really does ruin the whole bunch. Examples of proof of its existence. If you've got really green bananas, what do? Well, you put them in a brown paper bag with an apple. Why? The apple produces ethylene. the ethylene turns the bananas yellow. I mean, it results in the bananas undergoing their ripening process. So we want to reduce the amount of ethylene being evolved or produced by those crops that produce it, and reduce the sensitivity by those crops that are susceptible to injury. But there is a sticky wicket to all of this, and that is, depending on what commodity we are dealing with, there is a lowest safe temperature so that we do not have chilling injury occurring. Something like asparagus, we're probably going to plunge that in ice water, and it can be all the way down to 32 degrees. We don't want to freeze it, but we can be right there, right adjacent to freezing, and have good results with our storage. Other things like snap beans, cucumbers, and eggplants, we really don't want them getting much below 45 degrees, and so we do wind up with a situation where we may have to maintain more than one cooler if we are growing mixed commodities at our farm. This particular chart shows a couple of things. One is the length of storage time that you can anticipate being able to safely store commodity. It's a little different set of charts than what we looked at earlier, and it talks about the ideal storage temperature and what kinds of things are going to happen should we not keep the items, if we get to the point of having chilling. Here's another chart that shows basically the same information with the addition of showing what is the relative humidity that we want to store the commodity at. Most produce is going to want to be at somewhere around 90 to 95% relative humidity. And the deal is this: if we have a cooler that is really pretty full, then it's relatively easy to maintain 90 or 95% relative humidity inside that cooler. We've got a lot of produce in there. All of the produce is losing a little bit of water. That little bit of water that it's losing is going to keep our relative humidity up around 95%. But if we just have a few items in the cooler, then we have trouble, and we need to probably think about putting in humidifiers that are going to blow water into the air, and those humidifiers need to be hooked to a humidistat so that we don't ever, in general, we don't ever really want to be at 100% relative humidity. Free water kind of hanging out in the cooler is a recipe for a lot of problems from a food safety point of view, and can result in some enhanced decay. Most of the time we're going to want to be at, again, this 90 to 95% relative humidity. So humidifiers hooked to humidistats are a thing that you should. Another chart showing storage life, relative humidity. So we said that because we're going to have some differences, what kinds of things can we store together? Well, we can store things together that are all ethylene producers or that are all ethylene sensitive, but we don't really want to store things that are really good ethylene producers adjacent to things that are really ethylene sensitive. I'll give you an example. I go out this morning and I pick muskmelon, and I also pick green bell peppers. Life's great, got a good harvest of both of them. I go in, I set all of the melons on pallets and containers at the bottom of the cooler, and I put peppers up on shelves. I come back 2 days later, I open up my box of peppers, and all of these green bell peppers that I put in there have either a red or a yellow streak right down the side of them, or they may have even turned completely red or yellow. Well, what happened here? Well, I put muskmelon in the cooler, which produced lots of ethylene, and I put peppers in the cooler, which are really sensitive to ethylene, and the muskmelons have resulted in a hastening of the ripening of the pepper. So I would like to keep ethylene producers and ethylene sensitive crops stored in separate coolers. Additionally, there are other compatibility issues. We can only store things together that have a similar requirement for temperature. I cannot do a good job storing an item that would like to have 34 degrees storage temperature with an item that wants to have 55 degrees storage temperature. In a similar fashion, I can't store together items that require 90 or 95% relative humidity with an item that really only wants to be at 50% relative humidity. So do check for cold storage compatibility. This is another article from UC Davis or another downloadable PDF, but it's different than the first one. They go through and assign groupings so that these are items that can all be stored together. All the items in Group 1A, these can all be put in a single cooler. They have similar requirements for relative humidity and similar requirements for temperature. The one exception is that products marked with asterisk are sensitive to ethylene damage, and so we want to keep apples and muskmelon away from those crops that are sensitive to ethylene damage. Similarly, these are fruits, and again, these fruits and vegetables could also be stored in the same cooler. 32 to 36 degree temperatures, 85 to 95% relative humidity, with the exception of we have to watch and keep our ethylene producers and our ethylene sensitive crops away from one another. On Group 2, these are vegetables that require a higher storage temperature but still high relative humidity. And these vegetables, these fruits that have similar storage conditions, are vegetables that need stored relatively warm. They may still be in quote-unquote cold storage or controlled atmosphere storage. We're not going to have 65 degrees every day in September after we've harvested our winter squash. So, or perhaps a better example, ripe tomatoes, I'm going to want to store those at 60 degrees so that they maintain really good flavor. I'm not going to have 60 degree temperatures unless I have quote-unquote cold storage, but it's not going to be very cold storage. It's going to be, I guess, cool storage. That require higher temperatures for effect. Spend a minute sort of touching on cold storage methods. For a jillion years, underground storage and ice or storing things up at mountaintops, high altitude, were kind of hallmarks. We've gone from that to pretty much everything now. Not everything, but most everything is going to be mechanical refrigeration, where we've got refrigerant being driven by a compressor, and that's what's going to be most commonly used. There are some cases where we do see some evaporative cooling. These would be things like cool bots. If you've seen those, sometimes you'll see cool bots at a ballpark where we've got a little device that typically they're going to be like 4 foot by 4 foot. We've got a cardboard pad and a storage tank at the bottom. Water kind of dribbles down the cardboard pad. There's a big fan behind it that blows air through the cardboard pad, and that's the mechanism of evaporative cooling. It's used some, not really used very much in Illinois because its efficiency gets to be a problem. Evaporative cooling works great in an area where you've got low relative humidity occurring in the atmosphere. Those of you that have lived in Illinois very long know we have a lot of summer days where we have 90 or 92 or 94% relative humidity in the atmospheric air, and at that point evaporative cooling really doesn't have very much efficiency, hence our reliance principally on mechanical refrigeration. In mechanical refrigeration, there's two things that we should talk about, and one of them is forced air cooling and the other is simply room cooling. Room cooling just means that we've got a room that we're going to maintain at a cold temperature, hence the name room cooling. We've talked about this particular piece of equipment in the equipment session, so I don't really want to belabor it, but we do see more and more small growers going to utilizing window air conditioner units in conjunction with the utilization of a CoolBot for their cold storage requirements. They are relatively cheap to purchase and relatively cheap to maintain, and they work quite well in many circumstances. They are not the answer. Here's lots of information that you can see about places where CoolBots work well, places where they don't. Kind of the long story short, it's this. If we've got a building that, or if we have a building that is very leaky, or we're going to be opening the door a lot, or we're going to be putting in high volumes of produce that has got a significant amount of field heat in it, then CoolBots probably are not the best answer. They don't have enough freeboard of refrigeration. In other words, if we look at the capacity for refrigeration, if we're going to need to have a greater capacity because we're going to be going in and out the cooler 500 times a day, or we're going to be dumping in sweet corn that was picked at noon, it's going to be really hot and we need to get it cooled down really quickly. In those cases, CoolBots are not a good answer, but for most people, CoolBots are in fact a very effective and efficient mechanism for addressing our cold storage needs. Again, and I think we may have shown this in the equipment, but if not, hey, if you've got a cool room, a cold storage facility, buy the plastic straps. Just because you go in and out the door doesn't mean that we need to exchange all the air inside of the cooler and start over every time we go in and out. These plastic strips, they're a little bit pricey, but not only is it going to make you money back in the end because of savings in energy efficiency potentially, far more important, it's going to allow your room to stay at a more consistent temperature and not work your refrigeration. And lastly, I want to talk about some information that, rather than coming from California, this is really quite dated information, but still quite applicable and appropriate. And it is information from North Carolina State University. Introduction to Proper Post-Harvest Cooling and Handling Methods is a really great. There are some pictures from it. This is just room cooling. We've got, in this case, you can see the evaporators up on top of a walk-in cooler. That could just as easily be a CoolBot, a window air conditioner that you see up there where you see those two fans. It doesn't matter. This is simply room cooling where we've got a cold area and we stack commodity products like strawberries or sweet corn or raspberries, and there's actually two different reasons here I guess we should discuss. In the case of raspberries, they're highly perishable, and so we need to get all of the contents of the package cooled as quickly as possible. If we just take a flat of raspberries and put them into a cooler, sure, the fruit on top, that topmost veneer, gets cooled quite quickly, but it may be several hours before the fruit at the bottom of the pack actually get cool. How can we shorten that period of time that it takes to get all of the commodity cooled? And this goes back to sweet corn. Sweet corn where we've got 4 dozen ears in a wooden crate. Well, we've got some sweet corn obviously in the center of that crate. That's going to take a long time before the cold air ever reaches it if we just take the wooden crate and stand it in a corner in the cooler. We can decrease the amount of time it takes to get that entire crate cooled down by forcing air through the crate. Simply put, we go in and we arrange the pallets such that there's a gap between them. We've got a fan that is going to pull the cold air through the pallets or through the crates, either way, and eject it back into the room. By using this forced air cooling, we greatly decrease the amount of time it takes to get the center of the crate cooled, and that does result in a much longer shelf life for the entire pack. There are some really cool plans at this North Carolina state about how you can take and make yourself, in this case it's one used for raspberries, but a really cool portable forced air unit for getting raspberries chilled down. Again, raspberries, because they're so perishable, the prompt refrigeration is absolutely critical for their storage. Here's another thing that we're just going to touch on just briefly here for completeness. Probably not something for a beginning farmer, but this is a hydrocooler. Would be used for peaches in Illinois, sweet corn, things that are going to be picked when there's lots of field heat. We've got this big wooden crate. It's loaded onto this chain. The chain drags through this big tunnel that you see here, and almost ice cold water is going to pour down over the top of that crate as it enters into this tunnel. It's called a hydrocooler. And much like forced air cooling that we talked about earlier, this is a mechanism for almost instantaneously dropping the temperature of the entire contents of the crate down to the desired storage. This is an example of top icing, and we're going to blow ice into, we've arranged the pallets such that there are gaps and holes in it, and we're going to ice the pallets that it says should, at least could be top iced. Be very honest with you, in my experience in Illinois, the crops that I have seen top ice that came out of Illinois would be sweet corn and broccoli. Okay, we've talked about everything except for transportation methods. Now we've got to get our stuff from our farm to the farmer's market, to the restaurant, whatever. We're going to have to transport it. We can do it in a couple of different ways. We can obviously sometimes have to, because it's all we have access to, do it in an open vehicle, or we may do it in a refrigerator. If we've got an open vehicle, we really need to have some kind of canvas covering over it, or camper top, something so that the wind isn't drying out the commodity. As we go to refrigerated units, this is an example of the refrigerated unit, and if you've never been inside of a reefer trailer before, there's slots in the floor, and those slots are what allow the air to return and circulate back to the front of the truck. So we have a great big air delivery tube. You've seen tractor trailers with reefer units before. The refrigeration unit itself is at the front of the truck, but there is it's kind of like canvas. There's this air delivery chute that you can actually pull down, so that if you only have half of a truckload of item, you'll actually pull down and the air will only get thrown halfway back the trailer, and then it is going to fall, land on the floor, and then it gets pulled back down these return chutes, and the air just circulates around and around. As you fill the tractor trailer further and further, you're going to deliver the air further and further into the back of the. And here's an example of it. It's showing you right here. The refrigeration's at the front. Okay, there are a lot of good resources that are available, and I think there's going to be tours. Those of you that are fortunate enough to be on campus, I know that Zach has a very good washing and packing facility, particularly for greens, that you guys are going to get to go look at. It's really quite good. But for those of you that don't have the good fortune of being there, there are lots of places to find information, additional information on post-harvest. There are some of the sites that can be used, some additional references.